Hello everyone, this is FM Arne Jochens for Chess University with the first video for Chess Openings 101 Introduction to the King's Indian Defense. So in this first video we are going to take a look at some of the history of this opening, and we are going to introduce some of the basic ideas and themes and illustrate them with one of the sharpest lines, which is called the 4 pawns attack. So, all the way back in 1879, in the German town of Leipzig, there was a match between two German players, Adolf Schwarz against Louis Paulsen. And in the second match game, Louis Paulsen was playing the black pieces, and the opening moves went 1c4, knight f6, d4, g6, knight c3, bishop g7, e4, d6. Now, this black setup with the bishop on g7, the knight on f6, and also this move d6 being played, this is what we now call the King's Indian defense. And as you have noted in this game, white started with 1c4, which could have led to an English opening, but the order of white's first few moves didn't really matter that much here. White could also have started with 1d4, and we could still have reached the same position. So this setup, this King's Indian setup, can be played basically against all major white move orders, except of course for 1e4. Because if white plays 1e4 and then black plays knight f6, then white can already attack the knight with e5. So this is another opening called Aljechin's defense. Well, why is this opening called the King's Indian? This name was of course only later given to the opening, when several openings where black started with knight f6 emerged, and all of those were called the Indian openings, probably just to illustrate that they were somewhat mysterious or foreign to European players at the time. And in this opening, black has fianchettoed the king's bishop, meaning he has put the king's bishop on g7. So this opening was called the King's Indian, as opposed to the Queen's Indian, where black would put this bishop on b7, where black would fianchetto the queenside bishop, that is. So what are the ideas behind black's setup here? Well, first of all, this bishop on g7 is of course well developed. It is sitting on at least a potentially very useful long diagonal here. And already this bishop is putting some pressure, at least indirectly, on this pawn on d4. And of course black has played d6, so as to be able to develop the other bishop harmoniously as well. But the main strategic idea for black is based on the presence of this bishop on the long diagonal. So this bishop is already putting some pressure on d4, and in most lines black is going to try to increase that pressure. So in most lines black will try to increase the pressure against the pawn on d4, and this usually means that black will play either c5 or e5 pretty soon. So this is the reason why you could say that in most King's Indian lines black is following a dark square strategy. He's going to try to increase his influence over the dark squares, especially in the center. And I should mention this opening is part of a group of openings that today we call hypermodern openings, because traditionally it was thought that in the opening you should control the center by placing your pawns in the center. And this is of course what white has done here. White has put 3 pawns in the center already, and this does give him some nice central control. And with the first few moves here, black has not put any pawn on the 5th rank yet. So white already has more space in this position, but on the other hand, black has a slight lead in development, because black has already developed 2 pieces and white only has developed 1 piece. So black's idea, as I already mentioned, is going to play either e5 or c5, or more generally, black's idea is to attack the white pawn center. And this is very important, because if white gets time to consolidate his center, if white gets time to catch up in development and keep the central space advantage, well, then white is just going to be better. So in the next few moves, black needs to energetically strike against the white center. And this is the basic idea. Now I should mention some history. As I said, this position here first occurred in 1879, played by Lewis Paulsen with black, but it was only later that this opening really caught on, and in the 1920s this whole group of hyper-modern openings began to be developed, and the King's Indian was part of that. And then in the 1930s and later on, it was really becoming very popular to play this way as black, and that was mainly due to some Ukrainian players who analyzed and played this opening a lot, notably Boleslavsky, Bronstein, Geller and Konstantino Polski. And then after the Second World War, many elite players picked it up, and in the famous candidates tournament in Neuhausen and Zurich in 1953, this opening was played in many games, and many of the leading grandmasters played it with both white and black. And then of course even some world champions took it up. Bobby Fischer and Garry Kasparov were very fond of the King's Indian defense with black. And also many other very strong players played it regularly, for example Naidorf, Gligoric, Ullmann, and more recently we could mention Radjabov, Shirov, Topalov, Nakamura, and many others. Basically any great player with a very sharp style would like the King's Indian, because it often leads to very sharp games, as we are going to see. And in fact one of the sharpest lines is what we are going to look at in the rest of this first video. This is called the 4 pawns attack, and this was already played all the way back in 1879 in this very first King's Indian game. So Adolf Schwarz said to himself, okay, white is allowing me to put pawns in the center, so I'm going to take advantage of that, and I'm going to put another pawn in the center, f4. So this is called the 4 pawns attack. And it is certainly very logical. If black doesn't do anything to control the center with pawns, why not maximize the white pawn presence in the center? But you should note, this is another move that does not develop a piece. So this line is very sharp, because here the difference between the two strategies, white's central pawn presence against black's lead in development, is especially pronounced. So black castles. In the King's Indian, black is almost always going to castle kingside. In fact, this is one of the points of this development, knight f6, bishop g7, that black can castle early. So now black is ready to strike in the center. Now he doesn't have to be worried about the center opening up, because his king is already very safe. And of course the bishop on g7 adds some safety to the black king's position. Now finally white develops a second piece with knight f3. And now in this historic game, Schwarz against Paulsen, Paulsen played knight b to d7, which is playable, but it's a bit awkward to block the bishop like that, so we are not going to follow that game any further. Instead here I would like to take a look at a modern approach for black. So, as in most King's Indian lines, black should now quickly strike in the center, and this means playing either e5 or c5. Now c5 is certainly possible here, but this would arguably transpose to a different opening, which is the Benoni defense. Against the Benoni defense, where usually black plays c5 a bit earlier, but there are of course these transpositions. In the Benoni defense, white can also play this 4 pawns attack, so this is usually classified as part of that opening. But it's also of course very possible to play this way if you are a King's Indian player. But here I would like to focus on a different idea, which is to prepare the move e5. instead of c5. Now, knight bd7 as played in the historic game was of course one way to prepare e5, but there's a modern approach here which is to play knight a6, and I like this move a lot. Now why does this also prepare e5? Let's take a look. White should probably keep developing, so bishop e2 is very logical, developing the bishop and preparing to castle kingside. And now it turns out black can in fact play e5. Although it may look like this loses a pawn, there are some tricks and tactics here based on black's lead in development, and this move is actually possible. So why can white not just win a pawn? Let's say he takes with the f-pawn first, black recaptures. Why can white not just win a pawn by either taking with the pawn or with the knight on e5 now? Well, let's look at both. So if he takes with the pawn, then black is just going to exchange queens and play knight g4, and black is just going to regain the pawn. White can defend once more with bishop f4, but black can attack again. So black is going to regain the pawn, and then black is just slightly better because of the pawn structure, because white will keep this isolated pawn on e4, so black just has a slightly better pawn structure. And also note, here we can already see an outcome that is often achieved if the opening goes well for black. If you imagine this pawn on e5 is going to drop, black will have very nice control over the dark squares. This bishop will be very strong, because it will have an almost open diagonal here, and especially black will have very good control over the d4 square. The d4 square, because white has played c4 and e4, is a potential outpost square for black. Okay, let's get back to this position after f takes e5, d takes e5. As we have seen, if white takes with the pawn, black is going to regain the pawn and keep the better structure. So what happens if white tries to win a pawn in this way? Knight takes e5. Well, then we can see why this knight on a6, although it may look to be somewhat oddly placed here, is actually quite useful, because now this knight supports this central strike c5. And here this move is especially well timed, because not only does black attack the pawn on d4, but in doing so he also undermines this knight on e5. So this is a typical idea. Now white's whole center is starting to crumble here. For example, he cannot keep all the central pawns by pushing d5, because then this knight is undefended, and this allows a typical tactic for black. Whenever there's an undefended piece on this diagonal, you should think about how to activate your bishop on this diagonal. So here black has this typical tactic, knight takes e4, based on the fact that now there's this discovered attack against the knight on e5. So, well, I don't think white has anything better than to capture, but then black can regain the piece on e5. So, well, we still have equal material. You might think that white is better here because of the protected passed pawn on d5, but in fact I think black is slightly better, and this is again based on the fact that this bishop is very, very active, and because these two pawns are now fixed on light squares, the dark squares in white's position are very weak, which is what makes this bishop so strong. Especially, once again, you will note there's an outpost square on d4 for black. So black has a central outpost square, and white doesn't have a real outpost square. This knight can always be attacked by f5, so I think black is better here. So after c5, that's why d5 is not a good move for white. So I think he should just keep developing here with bishop e3. Now, of course, black could take on d4, but there's also a nice tricky move here, once again emphasizing that knight a6 was quite a clever move. Knight b4 is a good move here. And this sets up another typical tactic. Black now has a very nice threat. By the way, if I say anything like that in this course, if I say black has a nice tactic, you may always want to pause the video and think about the position for yourself, so that you can try to find the tactic if you don't already know the line. And here black can play, well, it's white to move, but if it were black to move, black could play c takes d4, based on this idea that if the bishop takes, then black has this pseudo queen sacrifice, queen takes d4. Because if queen takes d4, then finally there's knight c2 with a fork against the king and the queen. So black would win a piece in this line. So this is black's threat, and that's why knight b4 is a good move. And also note that in this line black is exploiting the lead in development, in the sense that white's king hasn't castled yet, and this allows this whole tactic with knight c2 check in the end. Okay, but it's white to move, so he may defend against this threat with rook c1, covering the c2 square. But now black has another typical tactic. He can now finish his development in a very efficient way. Although it looks impossible, I think bishop g4 is actually possible in this position. Developing the last minor piece and indirectly increasing the pressure here. So this is based on another way to activate this bishop on g7. As soon as the diagonal towards d4 becomes open for this bishop, there will again be this c takes d4 idea. So that's why white cannot just win a piece on g4. Say if he takes with the bishop first, we take with the knight, and now whichever way he takes, say he takes with the knight, we can regain the piece with this fork here. Because now the bishop is also supporting the pawn on d4. And this turns out well for black once again. Even though white may keep an extra pawn here, say white first pushes this knight back and then just castles. So I think we should take the bishop. Whenever, as black, you get a chance to take white's dark squared bishop in the King's Indian while keeping your own dark squared bishop, this is usually a very good idea, because, as I mentioned, black's main strategy is usually based on trying to play on the dark squares and ideally dominate the dark squares. And this of course gets much easier once you have a dark squared bishop but your opponent doesn't. So in this position, even though white has an extra pawn, I think black has very nice compensation because of the dominance over the dark squares. We can follow up with queen b6, and you can see we are dominating the d4 square and many related dark squares here. And this bishop is especially strong. So that's very nice compensation. Okay, so this was a long digression here explaining why in this 4 pawns attack, after knight a6, this move e5 is actually possible, and white cannot just win a pawn. Now we have looked at both d takes e5 and knight takes e5, and both didn't really turn out too well for white. So probably white's best move is just to play d5 in this position. But once again, now all white's central pawns are fixed on light squares, so black has already achieved something here. Black is getting closer to once again dominating the dark squares. And also in this line, the knight on a6 is actually well placed, because it can now jump to c5, hitting the e4 pawn. And actually white has to be careful here. He cannot just defend this pawn in the most natural way. So I think black has already equalized anyway, but let's just look at the most natural move by white here, queen c2. This allows another typical King's Indian tactic. Now black to move has a spectacular way to transform the central pawn structure. He can take on e4, despite this pawn being apparently well defended, because after knight takes e4, we have bishop f5 attacking and pinning this knight. So white has to defend with bishop d3. But then we can take on e4 and push f5. And we are going to regain the piece, because bishop d3 would allow e4 with another fork. So remember this idea. Knight takes e4, sacrificing the knight but opening up the way for the f-pawn, and often this pawn roller here, f5 followed by potentially e4, is going to trap one of the white minor pieces. So that's why this idea knight takes e4, this pseudo-sacrifice, is often possible. So here white wouldn't have anything better than to take on f5. Now there is of course the question, do we take with the pawn or with the rook? But in this position I like taking with the rook, because black can try to get an immediate kingside attack going here. For example, if white develops with bishop e3, we don't even have to bother defending the knight, because we can already start the attack with e4. If white takes on c5, this was actually played in a number of games, we can take on f3. Now of course it is high time for white to castle, because, well, among other things, queen e8 check is an idea for black. So let's say white castles kingside. Then we can play queen g5, and already black has an attack against the white king. Probably white should play king h1 in this position, as for example in the game Cook against Reilich. But in some other games rook a e1 was played, and I'm going to follow this because here I can show you some of black's attacking ideas. Now bishop e5 is a nice move, bringing a third piece into the attack. So as you can see, black has 3 pieces and a pawn, all very close to the white king. So it shouldn't be a surprise that this is quite dangerous for white. And for example, in a game Ghezalyan against Umansky, Moscow 1989, rook e4 was played, seemingly very logical. But here actually black could already have won with a direct attack. Black to move and win. It turns out that bishop takes h2. This sacrifice is already winning here, because after white takes we have queen h5 check. And now, well, if the king goes to g1, then we can just take on g2, threatening queen h1 checkmate. But if the queen takes, we have rook g5 winning the queen. So this is winning for black, but also king g3 should be winning, although it's surprisingly difficult to actually checkmate the white king here. But I think black has a win. We can play rook g5 check. Now king f2 fails to rook g2, winning the queen. So the king has to come out to f4. Then we can take on g2 with tempo, hitting the rook, which may try to blockade the pawn. And this is a nice move that now follows here, so you may want to find it. How can black finish off the attack here? He can do so with a surprising move. And to find that move you will have to note what white's key defensive piece is in the position. Black to move and win. I think there's only one winning move here. So I think white's key defensive piece is actually the bishop on c5, because it controls both the f8 square, preventing rook f8 check, but also it controls the f2 square, which is important because black has ideas to maybe get a rook to f2 in some way. As we have already seen in one line, sometimes such a check on the second rank is just going to win the white queen. So the bishop is a key defensive piece, and black can question this bishop by simply playing b6. And this is winning because now wherever the bishop goes there will be a drawback. For example, if the bishop goes to a3, keeping control of the f8 square, he's no longer controlling f2, and now black can get a rook to f2 with this sequence: rook f5 check, and queen check, and sooner or later the rook is getting to f2, for example king e2, queen g3, and there's no defense against either queen or rook, in fact, against this invasion to f2. Of course, if the king goes to d1, then we have rook f1 check. Yeah, either leading to checkmate or at least winning the rook, so this is an easy win for black. Okay, of course, this was a deep line here, and just one example of the many complicated lines that can arise in the 4-pawns attack. But I like this sequence here because it shows one typical king-side attack for black in this line. So once again, the basic idea is that against the 4-pawns attack, you should quickly strike in the center with either c5 or e5. And one interesting way to prepare e5 is this move knight to a6. And then you can actually play e5, even if it means sacrificing a pawn. As long as you get dark square dominance for the pawn, it's always going to be worth it, and black has very nice counterplay in these lines. So that's all for the first video, and in the second video we are going to take a look at all the major lines, and I'll try to give a brief theoretical overview of the major lines in the King's Indian defense. Bye for now.